Welcome to our first of the year C+B Community Talk in partnership with Heritage Months. We were so honored to have our first last week about building community and what that's going to look like in this in-person hybrid strange world that we're living in right now. But we're super excited for the conversation today. And with that, I want to start by first sharing our land acknowledgement. So before we begin, I do want to take a moment in the spirit of healing and peace to acknowledge and honor the indigenous peoples of the land upon which University of Denver stands, the Arapaho, Cheyenne, and Ute tribes, of whose loss we both recognize and mourn. Like the history of so many institutions in the American West, ours is complex and sometimes painful, and in recognition of this fact and to underscore our commitment to inclusion and equity with C+V and Heritage Months, we commit to listen and to affirm stories of all in our community. And we're super honored today for this panel for Latinx Heritage Months, an inclusive future for Latinx people in Colorado. I'm going to introduce our esteemed and amazing facilitator who will lead the conversation and do introductions. Christopher Pena, Director of Data Management at DU in the Office of Institutional Research and Analysis. He oversees institutional research operations at the university. The mission of his office is to advance equity, access, and success in higher education by ensuring a culture of assessment, data strategy, and data-informed decision-making. Chris comes to us and has worked in higher education for nearly 20 years and is a member of the board of directors of his professional organization, the Association of Institutional Research. He regularly presents on intersection of data strategy and DEI with a focus on identifying and dismantling structural racism. Christopher is also in the final year of PhD program. Virtual claps, that's amazing. And his program is Research Methods and Statistics, and his dissertation research examines the use of multiple regression to identify racial disparities in pay equity studies through the lens of critical race theory and critical quantitative analysis. So welcome, Chris. We're super excited to have you here. Thank you so much for facilitating this conversation. And with that, I will go off camera and be in the background. If anybody has questions, they can drop them in there. And Chris, it's all yours.
All right, well, thank you very much for that kind introduction, Chase, and for helping set up this session. I know we're all excited to have some good conversation today. As Chase mentioned, we have a great panel of speakers to join us today to talk through this topic of inclusion for the Hispanic and Latinx community here in Colorado. So to get started, I'd like to introduce you to our panel, and then we'll spend some time working through some questions and then some Q&A near the end. So to start off with, we have Denise Solis, who is the Interim Digital Collections Librarian and a visiting assistant professor here at DU. Denise was born and raised in Miami, Florida. She accepted a position with DU in 2018 as the University Library's first residency librarian. She earned a master's in Library and Information Science from Kent State University in 2017 and holds several committee appointments in professional organizations such as the American Library Association and Reforma, the National Association to promote library and information services to Latinos and the Spanish-speaking to support equity, diversity, and inclusion. She's also an editorial board member for the Open Access Journal in the library with the lead pipe. Her research focuses on diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility issues in librarianship, stemming from personal and professional experiences as a Spanish speaker, a first-generation college student, and a first-generation American of Nicaraguan descent. Now, as the interim digital collections librarian, she works to ensure institutional accountability and representation in our special collections, specifically those in the digital collections at DU platform, among other responsibilities. So welcome, Denise. Our second panelist is Joelle Martinez. She is the president and CEO of the Latino Leadership Institute. Joelle is a nationally recognized executive strategist, speaker, and facilitator. A visionary leader, Joelle dedicates her life to helping cross-sector leaders realize their individual potential, as well as the economic and social opportunities presented by an increasingly diverse US populace. Welcome, Joelle. And our third panelist is Dr. Lina Reznicek Parado. She's the Director of Spanish Program for Heritage Bilingual Speakers and is a Spanish teaching assistant professor at DU. Dr. Lina directs the Spanish for Heritage Bilingual Speakers program and is also a teaching assistant professor in the Department of Spanish Language, Literary, and Cultural Studies. Since joining DU in the fall of 2018, she has led curricular efforts to develop courses for Spanish heritage speakers, students who have personal, familial, or community connections to the Spanish language and are interested in furthering their unique linguistic skills in Spanish as part of their academic trajectory. Lina is an educator and researcher at the intersection of Spanish sociolinguistics and education, and is interested in issues around bilingual heritage language education and teacher training, academic language and literacy for linguistically diverse student communities, and topics surrounding Spanish in the US. Her work is informed by her own experience as an immigrant and bilingual educator. So welcome, Dr. Lina. All right. With all of our panelists introduced, I think we'll move into our question section, and it looks like Lina has joined us as well. Thank you for coming straight from class. We appreciate your time and presence here as well. As I mentioned earlier, the general topic of the session is on this issue of inclusion for our community here in Colorado. So we have a few questions that we'll talk through. We'll spend a few minutes on each one, and these will be generally open questions for our panelists. And we'd love to hear general thoughts, and for you in the audience watching, as you're listening, thinking about questions that you also have and comments that you'd like to share as we move towards the end of our session. So to start off with, I thought we could begin with a question addressing a topic that's probably on everyone's mind, and that is the pandemic, the world that we're living in today. It's been about 1.5 years since we entered the pandemic, and in Colorado, there's been a strong focus on ensuring equitable support for communities of color, which public officials know are more likely to be disproportionately affected in terms of economic impact and health outcomes. So for our panelists, what are some of the unique challenges that the Hispanic and Latinx community in Colorado has faced during the pandemic? And what are some of the ways in which our community, government agencies, and nonprofit organizations have been successful in helping our community cope effectively with and recover from COVID-19?
Chris, I'm happy to get us started today. When the pandemic hit, like so many people, it was both something so personal and also something that amplified what many of us know in this work, and that there's so many disparities and inequities before a pandemic that anything like this is just going to intensify some of those challenges that we face. Personally, you know, I lost a grandmother within the first couple of weeks of COVID hitting, and it just was real very quickly, but my experience was not isolated because so many in the community were beginning to share those stories. And so at the LLI, we went into complete activation mode, and we partnered with a national Latino research firm that we do a lot of work with. And we were one of the first surveys out in the country and then here in Colorado asking questions about impact on COVID, because we knew that while the narrative was going to be this was extraordinary, we knew there are folks that are often undercounted, not asked to, Spanish speaking, not on anyone's radar. And we knew as frontline workers and essential workers, uninsured with pre-existing health conditions, that this pandemic was going to be extraordinary for our community. And by August, our second survey came out and said, by August, 50% of our community was already facing economic hardship, worrying about paying for their bills, furloughed, you know, concerned about their health, having to leave their jobs because they didn't have affordable childcare. You know, they didn't have the benefit of being able to hire someone while they continued to work when the schools were shut down. And then we really got the impact of the health disparities that came, you know, not having access to early testing, misinformation or no information at all in Spanish. So I think that for me, the pandemic, and for many in our community, all it did was really show what we've been talking about for a really long time, that economics and health, social, capital, access to quality information, digital divide. I mean, when everyone else was benefiting from Google searches or being able to teach our kids remotely, you know, we had communities that were still not connected to the internet. So the pandemic had real and lasting impact, but what I hope it really does for people is underscore that these disparities that I think we often think have fixed themselves or no longer exist, not only persist, but I think now have widened because of the pandemic.
I was just going to add along the same lines of what Joelle said in terms of these disparities that aren't new, right? So all of these things that had been happening, I feel like the pandemic has really highlighted that in so many levels. I think not just as a community, but like as an individual. I don't know if you all relate to that. But I was thinking about these disparities in terms of language barriers. Specifically, certainly that is the topic that I spend most of my time thinking of as a language educator. But thinking about, not this language barrier between English and Spanish, which is sort of the language barrier we are most maybe prone to, but actually in terms of the Spanish that is available to communities at large. So Joelle used the words underrepresented, undercovered, underrecognized. And I think that in terms of our communities, those Spanish-speaking individuals who are the most commonly underrepresented are those that speak stigmatized varieties of the language, or perhaps unrecognized varieties of the Spanish language. And I think that people who make available materials in Spanish, I think there is work to do in terms of the implications of the many ways that our Spanish-speaking community speaks, and the fact that that could actually be a language in and of themselves if we're not also including sort of the non-standard ways to refer to something or to communicate something. So not just the non-standard, but also the different ways that we speak Spanish. I mean, there's so much linguistic diversity within the communities that we serve that we are just like, okay, it's in Spanish. All right, what does that mean is in Spanish, how are we being intentional about producing material that's linguistically responsible, so to speak?
Yeah, I just want to echo that. So I'm Nicaraguan, like my family's from Nicaragua, and it's a very different Spanish from Mexican Spanish, for example. And I actually served as a volunteer for DU's vaccine clinic because they needed Spanish speakers. And it was funny because a lot of the times we would be talking about the same thing, but using different words. Mascarillas, for example, I say mascara, which is, it could not necessarily wrong, but me and my family, we just use that word to refer to a mask. And also to just echo what Joelle and Lena have said, there have been underlying issues already, and the pandemic just brought them even more to light, even though we all knew they were there anyway, or at least, the people experiencing them knew they were there. And one of the biggest things too that I learned from serving on that vaccine, like serving as a caller for that vaccine clinic at DU, was that a lot of people, rightfully so, were not they had a mistrust of these resources, right? To sign up to get a vaccine, a lot of people didn't want to go a second time because they were scared of maybe being deported, or, there was fear there, rightfully so. We have a detention center in Aurora. Like how do we not separate that from everything that's happening? And I know people who have been deported, right? It's community trauma. It's these things that just exacerbate these issues. And so even getting a vaccine is not just, oh, get a vaccine, it's like, well, you have to come back for that second shot, and what's going to happen if I come back? So a lot of people that I talked to too were, wanted at that time the Johnson & Johnson, I believe it was, the one where you just get one shot. And so they wanted it to be like just one and done. And even people that I spoke to, it's not so much that they didn't know English, they also spoke English, but they were more comfortable speaking Spanish. And that's another thing too, like people do know, this isn't, I think, an issue where people don't speak English. It's just that society has taught them when they do, they're harassed for it because they don't speak it like well or perfectly because they have an accent, it's stigmatized. And so, I think that's also just echoing what Joel and Lena have said. Like, it just brought up a bunch of issues that have already been there.
I really appreciate your comments, especially on the diversity within the Spanish-speaking community, both in terms of language and culture around that. And it makes me think in my own office, we're very fortunate to have an analyst who comes from a Spanish-speaking background and does qualitative research as well. And so thinking about doing research and outreach and survey design in particular, where we're collecting information or leading focus groups, having that attentiveness to, well, the way that I speak Spanish may not be the way that someone else does, or the word choice, as Joelle mentioned, I'm sorry, Denise mentioned, can have specific implications, both in terms of the data, but also the way that we're establishing rapport and relationships, trust building with those communities. So very important to think about as we think about those outreach efforts during a health crisis like this. Well, with all of our panelists, we heard the same theme, I think, of exacerbating existing conditions. And I think that leads us nicely into our second question, which focuses on something that many of us here who are residents in Denver often think about, and that is our housing situation. So as Denver's economy continues to boom, increased migration has placed an ever increasing strain on the city's housing market. Rental prices are some of the highest in the country today, and home ownership seems out of reach for many young people and middle-class families. At the same time, revitalization efforts are pushing Hispanic and Latinx residents out of more historically diverse parts of the metro area, while increasing a number of white residents are moving into them. So as we think about growth in Denver over the next decade, what are some of your concerns about these trends and how they impact diversity and economic justice in our city? And what challenges and opportunities do these changes present to the Hispanic and Latinx community here in town?
I'll start. So first, we know that there are really three ways to cultivate and develop wealth and generate wealth for a community. Wealth and equity, the great wealth gap, is critically important. It's a multi-generational thing. It's housing, it's entrepreneurship, and it's inheritance. And one of the most difficult things with the housing crisis and home affordability is that it actually delays our ability, because that is usually how most middle-class folks begin to develop wealth, regardless of race and ethnicity. And what's happening in Colorado and Denver specifically is not just that we can't move here, it's what happened to the gentrification process, and a lot of the homeowners that lived in their homes for multiple generations, particularly in the Global, Elyria, Swansea neighborhoods. We lost many Latino homeowners in those three communities, not because their homes were so affordable, but because unaffordable. Most of them own their homes free and clear. We lost them because the property taxes, because the valuations of those houses became so high that they no longer could meet their property tax obligations. So imagine owning your home. Some of these homes pass through multiple generations, mind you, and no longer being able to stay in this home because of property taxes. We have to be better, more prepared on the legislative side, on the policy setting side, of how we protect our homeowners when they own homes, because it takes us so much work just to get them to be homeowners. The second thing I think with home and affordability issues is, we've played around with ideas around land grants and some of these other opportunities, first-time home buying. One of the biggest challenges we have is still to work on the finance side. There is bias, systemic bias in our lending processes. One of the most institutionalized racial elements is within our financing institutions. How we have applied lending practices, how we have defined zip codes as higher risk for lending over other zip codes, mostly from the BIPOC community and Latino communities, as seen as high-risk investments. So we have to tackle it from a policy side of how do we protect the homeowners, as we see these properties rise, and we have to begin to work on the financial side, because until we dismantle that systemic racism and bias that lives within our financial institutions, we can't get the capital and lending in order to purchase those homes. And the third piece of the puzzle is wage disparities. As a Latina, I still make 54 cents on the dollar to my white male counterparts. And it doesn't matter, same education level, we can do apples to apples there. So how am I ever going to afford a home if I am barely being able to make ends meet? So we also have to address the wage disparity in order to address the home access to home ownership.
So I have to be honest and say that I don't believe I have much to contribute to this question in terms of all of the technicalities. I think Joelle just educated me, thank you, in terms of the systemic and systematic issues that there are out there in the world outside of academia. I'm also somewhat new to Denver, and so I think still understand the history of the city in terms of its cultural heritage as I probably should before answering this question intelligibly. But I guess one thought that comes to mind in terms of where I see things sort of in a limited way in this particular question is the idea of what does it mean for a neighborhood to be Latino, right? So I think part of that definition is the inheritance piece or the traditional and the history of where Latino communities have lived, Sunnyside, Highlands, etc. I guess being a new resident and a new Latina resident to Denver, I think about sort of these new ways of being Latino, right? Of maybe younger people who are more of a hybrid Latino and, perhaps aren't all in the same place, but they are sort of showcasing their Latinidad in ways that maybe aren't as visible as our traditional, Latino or Mexican neighborhoods, but that are there and are sort of vibrant and present. And I think our city would be richer if we acknowledge these new sort of, hybrid Latino spaces. I'm just thinking in my own neighborhood, I'm Colombian and my neighbor is Colombian, and sometimes we'll have our Colombian flag out there, and we love going up to Colfax to the tiny Colombian joint that's there. And I feel like those aren't not traditional Latino neighborhoods or places, but I feel like I can be Latina, and like, just, I don't know if I'm making sense, but anyway, those are some of my thoughts.
I love that. And I feel the same way thank you, Christopher, for reading my bio. Like, I'm from Miami originally. So I'm going to pull some experience from there because there's so much going on in Miami. And there is a really fascinating study called The Color of Wealth in Miami. Read it. But again, like I said, I was going to pull information, like experience from my life. My mother was a hotel worker, que descanse en paz. She died in 2019 from breast cancer. But she worked as a hotel maid in Miami Beach. We did not live in Miami Beach, but a lot of the times, right, reflecting what Joelle said, like, because Latinx people are being pushed out of areas where major work, like where they work, not only are they having to then commute, not waste time, but spend a lot of their time and money if they have a car, taking the bus. And so it becomes this like cycle. Like, imagine, and honestly, I see myself reflected more in the custodial staff and just the staff at this institution than I do as faculty. And so I can't imagine being like a custodial worker who's having to pay, like if they're living in Aurora, to come here, then pay the exorbitant amount of money for parking. That's just, we have to break the cycle, invest. One thing that you can do is invest, rethink your parking fees, rethink the way that we charge for things. So yeah, sorry, that's what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think what we're hearing here is that oftentimes when we talk about issues like housing, there's very clear intersections with many different other areas of public interest, as Joelle touched on, in terms of wages, and I think access and entry is what we often hear as the focus point of the conversation, but it's not just about what happened in the past decades ago. We know Denver, like many cities, had a very unfortunate history around redlining and specific practices to isolate communities and prohibit mortgages and lending practices, even just to get in the door to homeownership. And so then thinking about, unfortunately, once people are able to get past that hurdle, what are we doing today, and thinking about policies, practices, and certainly from the legislative side to encourage that continuity over time and not push against it. So I think what I'm hearing here, and I want to be mindful of our time, it actually leads us really nicely maybe into our last question. So I'll jump ahead just a little bit to that, which really touches on this idea of identity. And we've heard all of our panelists talk about both their personal identity and the importance to our Denver community. So as we've been talking today, we've been using these terms of Hispanic and Latinx, and these terms can have unique and highly personal meaning to individuals. And you probably heard some variations as each of us have been speaking. Across the country, a variety of regional identities and ways of understanding shared community have also been developed, such as Chicano communities in California, in my home state of Texas, Tejano communities. Our language around these identities continues to evolve, especially as we seek ways of honoring our heritage while striving for more inclusion, for example, by adopting gender neutral terms. So what are some of the ways in which the Hispanic and Latinx community and identity has grown and developed in Colorado that our attendees here may not know about? And I think some of you have touched on this, but how do you see identity evolving here in our own state, especially among our young people? And what are some of the areas that you were excited and proud to see?
I'll start this one talking maybe exclusively about our young Latino students here at DU, since I'm mostly involved with that student community. So I direct the Heritage program here at DU, and the Spanish for Heritage bilingual program is designed to is designed specifically for students who identify as Latino, the great majority of them, and who have grown up with the language in a very unique way, meaning at home, usually with family members, and in the community through community ties. Students who are heritage students have been speaking the language and have, for the most part, oral fluencies that are extremely amazing. They function in the language in an oral form perfectly and efficiently, but they have not had access to formal schooling in the language mostly. And so there are some who might have taken a high school class here and there, but for the most part, my class and my program is the very first time that they have to write and in Spanish. And so we learn about academic literacy, certainly, but we also work through a lot of other topics of discussion, such as identity. And it's really interesting to it's very clear that students have really struggled with this idea of identity, right? So when you live in a place where you are neither from there, right? So you grew up here, you're not from there. And so maybe you have been told that you don't speak well enough or differently, and you're not a real whatever. But then you were also not the mainstream face of what America or the United States is either, and so you're sort of in this like third space, and that's tough for young people. And so we talk about those ideas in class quite a bit. And I think more and more what I am noticing is that students aren't really wanting to be your traditional sense of what a Latino is. They don't really necessarily want to be like their parents or their grandparents who pushed sort of Spanish away. So we're not going to speak Spanish, we're going to speak English because we need to assimilate. This is what we're going to do. They really want to embrace their Spanish identity, and they want to be bilingual, right? And they want to be American, and they want to be Latino at the same time. So I think we're seeing more and more this more of the bilingual, or I think I read somewhere that it's called the 200%er. So I'm 100% American and I'm 100% Latino. So I'm a 200%er. This is who I am. And it doesn't look like anything I've known, but it is something new. And I want to be able to maximize my language skills and my cultural abilities and my knowledge of both cultures so that I can sort of, be who I am. And I certainly see that in the sort of the new cohorts coming in, and it's really actually pretty, it's great, it's exciting. And I mean, I see it in my group. I don't know how it is happening in the community necessarily, but it's certainly exciting to see what's going to come out of this generation of Latinos, young Latinos.
Yeah, can I just give a shout out to Lena, because she is amazing and she deserves all the money and she should be director of the program, and please do you pay her, because it's not just about, right, we're all trying, and I agree with everything she said, because also growing up in Miami, I was in the majority. I came to Denver and it was a culture shock. It was a lot, and it's taken me some time, I finally found my little restaurants here and there. But honestly, Spanish is one of those things that I feel like has grounded me in my identity. I feel like if you know Spanish, you know the whole me. And I think that Lena is just so awesome to have that program, because students can then also, they can have a better sense of personal identity. They can have that support, that mentorship. And it really is just I don't know how to explain it, but anyway, I just want to say that also I'm part of Reforma, which their name is really long, but Reforma is the National Association to promote library and information services to Latinos and the Spanish speaking. And for a couple of years now, we've been trying to see if we can change that from Latinos to Latinx, but then there's also Latine. And so I'm with Lena, I'm really excited to see where younger generations are taking this to be more inclusive. With the conversations I've had, at least in my little bubble of Reforma and librarianship, it seems to be a generational divide too. The more experienced folks tend to just want to Latino, Latina, they had to shift from the whole Hispanic to Latino thing. So it's also for them kind of we've been through this already, we're done, just pick something to name us and we're gonna deal with it. But I feel like younger generations are just no, we're gonna do what we want and we're gonna be our whole selves and you're gonna take it. We're not gonna fall into your, classification. So yeah.
Well, first, ladies, thank you for your work and leadership. And I mean, the stewardship of the next generation, I think, is what fuels us all and gives us hope. And, I think especially in these moments and times when there's a lot going on. And I think this panel, and Christopher included, is a perfect example of the great diversity, vibrancy, and complexity of Latino, Latina, Latinx, Hispanic, Nicaragua, I mean, you name it, we are all of that. And then we haven't even gotten into race. We're touching on nativity. We are Afro-Latino, Asian Latino. We come from all different spaces and places. We speak different languages. We celebrate different cultures. I'm a 9th generation. So me, myself, I'm very different in the room. I'm a 9th generation Coloradan. My family has been in the San Luis Valley in northern New Mexico since the 1500s. They moved from the San Luis Valley to Denver a couple generations ago. And in making that move, they had to let their language go. They had to let their culture grow, because in those days in Denver, you could not speak Spanish and have any chance at moving towards prosperity. It was a survival tactic that still pains many of us today. As we continue to move on through our work at the LLI, I use this metaphor this morning with my family, is that I feel like we are constructing this huge tent. And oftentimes I can feel like I run out of fabric because there's just not enough fabric to keep sewing. The United States Census coming out from the 2020 really reinforced this point. In a state like Colorado, we saw a 300% increase of Latinos who were identifying as multiracial or other because boxes no longer work for us. We don't fit into those boxes. Actually, we never did. So part of the real challenge and opportunity for Latinos and what that means for us is not only have I in my lifetime gone from being Hispanic to American to Latina to Latino American Hispanic, I don't know, right? In my own lifetime, I've gone through my own iteration of my own identity, but we as a community keep going through it. And I think sometimes we have to fight against this push for like to make it easy, because it's not, and I don't think it should be. And we got to find enough space for all of this to fit into. And especially around these racial issues, we can't let that go, because I think there has been a lack of conversation about our multiracial past connectivity, you know, and I think that has to be talked about. The different nativities have to be talked about. How we treat and judge one another, not Latina enough. I am so tired of hearing that. What does that mean? Please tell me, because I'm in this work every day. So I just think that I liken it like an artichoke, many layers, but I promise if we keep working at it, we'll get to the heart of this. But we have to appreciate it for its layers, its complexity, its beauty, its vibrancy. And this next generation that you two ladies are in the part of, like, you know, helping to steward, like that's where the hope comes, because I think they are pushing against the nice, easy fix, check the box, right? They don't want that. And that gives me hope.
I was just going to highlight that this lack of conversation. I think this encompasses what we're trying to say is we need to talk about the complexity in order to make it work for our communities. And this lack of conversation, I think, is present in all levels of society, in all of the spaces we work, in the public sector, in the librarian network, in the Spanish department / professor curricula. Spanish curricula in most institutions is still this binary view of, you know, Latinos, it's either Spain or Latin America, and that's it. Okay, what about us here? And how do we re-envision the way that we teach the language, even to second language speakers, people who are wanting to learn Spanish that are not Latino necessarily, that are like, oh, I want to speak like they speak in Spain. Well, but that's not speaking Spanish, or that's not the complete picture. And if you go out to the communities in Colorado and you speak like someone, like a professor, you're not going to really get far. So there's just so much to do in so many areas of the work that we do that I think having these conversations is really the first step. And so I'm grateful to be doing that.
I think all of our panelists are really connecting with our audience, because that was actually one of our first questions from our viewers about this idea of the nomenclature, this language around Hispanic and Latinx and what that means. And just to give a little bit of my own perspective, looking at it from an IR lens, one of the challenges that we really face, I think this applies to all of social science research, is exactly what all of you have touched on, this idea of putting people into boxes, artificial constructs. And is it more about how people identify themselves? Or is it more about how a government agency or nonprofit is looking to classify people? And it's this very difficult tension of, we want to study and understand, especially in terms of movement, access, success, these things that we're all interested in. We want to see how progress is looking, to do assessment along the way in particular. So we have to understand communities. But as we've all been talking about, identity is incredibly complex. And for those of you who are familiar with, say, the federal census, the categories that are used, we've heard that come up a little bit. There was a provost luncheon a few years ago by a researcher who spoke about the Colorado census and the history of how Hispanic and Latinx communities had been categorized within the state, and just seeing that evolve over time as people understood our community in different ways. Very interesting. I'm fortunate to hear about that. But looking at the federal level, if you filled out a questionnaire, you know that you're always presented with that two-parter if you identify as Hispanic first, and then your racial identity. And regardless of how you identify racially, you're rolled up into Hispanic. There are certain reasons for that, and I'm not arguing for the positives of that. That's just the reality. But what we lose in a lot of the information is the granularity and the intersection of identity that lies beneath that. Especially, we know many of our Hispanic identifying individuals also identify, as Joelle mentioned, as coming from an African or Afro-American background, Native American in particular, and even just the struggle of, do you identify as white and Hispanic and Latino as an ethnicity? Is it more about your cultural and linguistic alignment? There are so many issues that we often miss by these categories that just make it easier to put people into a box. So I really appreciate all of you bringing that to the forefront. And I would encourage our audience viewers to think about that as they walk away from this session. There's actually a comment too, I think, that spoke to one of the panelists, this idea of being too brown for the United States and too American for my parents, their homeland. So that's an issue that many of us, I think, struggle with in terms of that tension of identity. And also, as Lena mentioned, getting to that biracial, multiracial reality of so many of our younger generations that are coming forward and thinking more critically about how they identify both personally and publicly. All right, so I'm just taking a look here. And really a lot of appreciation for sharing everyone's personal background, and especially from the educational perspective. And Lena, I don't know if you want to speak to this a little bit more. This is actually another question that we jumped past for time. If you want to mention just briefly, this last year, some people may not know that our Department of Languages and Literatures had actually reorganized a little bit to break out our Spanish language, literature, and cultural studies. Could you speak maybe just a little bit to the rationale behind that and what you're hoping to accomplish with that work?
Yeah. So up until, like you said, a year or so ago, all of the languages were within one unit. The pragmatics of managing a group so large were very, very challenging in all of the levels of the leadership, the structural organization, and all that. And so the college decided to split. Mainly the Spanish became its own unit because of the numbers that we bring into the language learning programs here at DU. So we are, not surprisingly, the biggest language program at DU. Spanish is usually the biggest language program in any institution in this country. As you know, more than 30, 40 million people speak the language, and that's not counting people who learn it as a second language. So it certainly has given us leeway and space to start having conversations about how to re-envision a program based on the sociolinguistic realities of the US and the Spanish language in our country, as opposed to as traditionally envisioned. You know, Spanish is spoken in Latin America and in Spain, and that's it. And so we have been working hard to have these conversations, and not just have conversations, but implement changes to the curriculum that can better situate a program as a program interested in visual and in making visible our communities here in Colorado, here in the US, as well as those communities abroad. So the Heritage Program is certainly part of that movement. It is a program that, again, looks at the US as a context where Spanish is spoken and where Spanish is relevant, and looks at people who speak Spanish in our country as relevant to these conversations. There are other, what's the word in English? I'm thinking in Spanish. There's other movements towards that at the curricular level. So for example, we have now it's like a grammar course. So, you know, every student, second year, third year, before they go on to upper level courses, they're like, oh, my grammar, I need to work on my grammar. So they want a grammar course. So I tell them I have this grammar course for them, but I kind of trick them a little bit, because I say, all right, we're going to talk about grammar, but what I don't explicitly say is we're going to talk about grammar as an ever evolving aspect of language. And it's ever evolving because if you look at grammar across all Spanish speaking communities in the world, including the US, there are all of these variables to grammar. So who's to say that grammar is grammar? Well, the standardized, Academia, La Real Academia Española says that this is the standard way, and this is all you've been taught. But actually, if we look at actual data of people speaking, we see that these variables are really different depending on what community, what influences you've had from other languages. There's a lot of indigenous influences, indigenous language influences in a lot of varieties. Mexican Spanish, for example, a lot of Afro-linguistic influences in the Caribbean, where we see these variability to the grammar that we're so used to learning. So I think that was a lot to say that. We are making an effort to make the invisible more visible in the language, in the language classroom, and not just for our Spanish-speaking countries, but importantly for those who are not, those who are learning this language as a second language, but that are going to want to be using this language in the communities as they interact with other Spanish speakers in the US, not even abroad. So anyway, we're having these conversations. It's a slow process, but yeah, it's certainly an exciting time for that.
Thank you. And Joella, Denise, as we start to close out, I wanted to give you an opportunity to maybe connect with some of the comments that Lena made. One of our questions from a viewer was about how we can, or how that person can connect with the Latinx community at DU, but I'm also thinking maybe more broadly at the Denver community, especially for those who are interested in leadership and moving in that direction towards executive practice. What are some resources or opportunities that you might recommend, or just some different ways that they can think about to become more involved?
Yeah. Well, as some of you may know, the LLI was housed at the University of Denver, and we actually separated in July with all good intention and motivation, because we just outgrew. We're doing so much and we're expanding our reach. So the DU community, and obviously I'm here today because I believe so much in this relationship and partnership. DU was played a huge role as being our incubator in those early years to really propel our success. So I would encourage folks to go to our website, latinoslead.org, not only because you can learn about some of the programs that we offer, but because one of our biggest assets is really the social network and social capital that we've been able to cultivate throughout Colorado. We have 232 alumni who are extraordinary leaders creating change every day in their communities and organizations. Folks that are serving on boards or in elected office, leadership in corporations now, even aerospace engineers who are managing the Mars mission through Lockheed and NASA. So what I love most about the work we do is we really do believe that the greatest potential is actually in our community already. So when we can connect the dots and make sure that people have access to one another is when I believe that really does take shape. So there isn't many places throughout the state that we don't have alumni as part of. You can go on the website and look through that, but definitely reach out. We have an awesome newsletter once a month, got to make a plug, where you're going to get our research, our data, but most importantly, highlighting these extraordinary leaders who are really, I think, the future of our community. So definitely invite you to continue to reach out to us.
Yeah, and I want to just kind of echo how important that community building is, and that mentorship and that support network. And I hate to say this, but I think DU really needs to step its game up. In the past couple of years, we've lost like a lot of people of color, faculty of color, staff of color, Dr. Judy Kiyama, most recently like Dr. Johnny Ramirez, Dr. Maria Islas Lopez, some more I-RISE postdocs that we could have kept to help, be role models and be a support system for students here. Which, by the way, shout out to our students of color, because navigating DU is incredibly difficult. And without these areas of support, I mean, even as a faculty member, it's really difficult to navigate. I've been able to be friends, make friends with Lena and like Deb Ortega and Lorena Gaibor, who they run Hermanas Latinas, which is a support network for graduate students, but also faculty, because I go there too, right? Which is also, I think, in collaboration with the Assistant Network. They do a lot of events together. So on campus, I know Like those two are really great support systems. And again, just like DU needs to step its game up and hire more faculty of color, staff, everybody. We need more students of color. And we need them to support our students of color when they're here. We all, I think, have heard about that incident that happened September 10th. And from what I know, and I could be wrong, but the administration hasn't said anything about it. So, you know, we need that support, both financially, emotionally, everything.
Definitely, Denise. And my office, for those of you who don't know, we work under the Office of the Provost ultimately, so academic administration. And one of the challenges that we see sort of on the side is there's a clear push to hire more diverse faculty, especially faculty of color. But the challenge is we are a predominantly historically white institution. We have certain cultural challenges that come with that. And as prospective faculty, especially those that we're very eager to recruit and attract here, top leaders in their field or those next generation researchers, they look to our student body, they look to our faculty, and in particular our administration, and they look for not just compositional diversity, but that we're taking meaningful steps to create an inclusive environment and what that actually looks like for them. So I know it's a conversation. I think most of us would like to see more progress at this point, but I'm always grateful for colleagues like all of you here on the panel who actively participate in that work and contribute both voice and representation and thought leadership to really help that move forward in ways that we can. Well, I think that brings us to the end of our scheduled time for conversation and discussion. I really appreciate all of your participation and the great comments that you've shared with us today. And just looking at the comments, I think many of the thoughts that were presented here were echoed by our audience members who also felt a connection to many of the things that were said here, both in terms of identity and experience. So with that, we'll turn it back over to Chase to wrap up the session.
Thank you all so much. Honestly, truly honored to hear that conversation and be a part of this work through Community Plus Values and the Heritage Months Committee. And we did want to let viewers know that if you visit du.edu/equity/celebrating-heritage-months, you can see more resources, information about Latinx Heritage Month, along with all the upcoming Heritage Months events as well, and learn about the offices that work on that. And then if you do want to learn more about Community Plus Values, we are truly honored and so appreciative to be a part of building a greater sense of belonging, inclusion, and community at DU. And so we know it's a long road. I so appreciate the authenticity and sharing your personal experiences on this panel, and about how DU can always do better. And that's where we land, is trying to figure out what that looks like. And so feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions at Community Plus spelled out values at du.edu. We encourage you to follow us on social media. We will have our next upcoming Heritage Months events on October 14th and October 28th. So those are, save the dates. We will have more information. It's every Thursday, every time on Thursdays from 11:30 a.m. to 12:30 p.m. And again, thank you to the panelists for giving your time during this conversation. And we hope that everybody took a little nugget that they can bring back to their communities. And with that, we will close out. But thank you so much again, and have a good rest of your week, everybody.